This is your chance. Okay. This is your chance to put your questions to the panel. Please feel free to ask questions as the speakers are talking in the Q&A function, which you'll find in the kind of menu strip at the bottom. We're going to do written submitted questions and then run the Q&A session via Michael Edmondson from SHOAL. You can also upvote on each other's questions, and that's going to put the most popular ones up to the top. And we've got about 30 minutes at the end of the webinar to answer as many of your questions as we can. If you have any other issues or questions that are kind of not for the panel, please put them in the chat function, not in the Q&A. My colleague Elizabeth's going to be watching that and will do her best to help you. So the webinar today, we've got some really good, interesting talks for you about a range of topics to do with freshwater fish conservation. Our keynote speaker today is Mike Baltzer of SHOAL. And then we're really lucky to have Sarah of Progres and Dr. Tan Heok of the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum at the National University of Singapore. First up, we're going to have a recorded welcome from Narissa Chow, Director of ASAP, and then Rupali Raghavan, who's Head of Terrestrial Species and Conservation Planning at Mandai Nature. So first up with Narissa. Sorry, just bear with us whilst we get her message ready. We hope everybody is feeling good today, whatever time of day it is. I know we've got people from all over, so for some of us it's quite early, and for others, hopefully it's a very leisurely lunch session today.
Hi everyone, thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar. We at Mandai Nature are dedicated to protecting Southeast Asia's threatened species, protecting and restoring ecosystems, as well as delivering positive benefits to local communities. We deliver conservation impact by supporting and funding partnerships, particularly for species that are overlooked and don't get the conservation actions that they deserve. Unfortunately, 1/3 of all freshwater fish in the world are threatened. 30% of them are found in Southeast Asia and include species like the Mekong giant catfish that's seen behind me. With the launch of the strategic framework, as well as this webinar, we hope to ramp up the much needed awareness as well as conservation actions that's required for freshwater fish species in this region. While we still do need to make sure that there is sufficient conservation action for freshwater fish species in their habitat, this framework also highlights the important role that zoos and aquaria can play for conservation of freshwater fish in the region. We can have safety nets for these species by ensuring that we have insurance populations and conservation breeding programs for them. I look forward to today's presentations by our experts who have actually dedicated their lives to the conservation of freshwater fish in Southeast Asia.
Thank you, and just sorry to note that was Rupali Raghavan of Mandai Nature, Head of Terrestrial Species and Conservation Planning. We've got our videos the wrong way around this morning. So introducing now is Narissa Chow, and Director of ASAP.
Morning, afternoon and evening, and it's wonderful to see everyone today. Welcome to this webinar about freshwater fish conservation in Southeast Asia, and thank you so much for joining. I hope you'll enjoy hearing from the lineup of inspiring speakers that we have for you today. This webinar follows on from the launch of a new report released last week. The strategic framework to accelerate urgent conservation action for ASAP freshwater fishes in Southeast Asia has been the result of a number of years of work and through a collaboration between ASAP, SHOAL, and Mandai Nature. Freshwater fishes are the largest group of ASAP species and are sadly overlooked in conservation terms. The report aims to draw attention to their plight and catalyze action to prevent extinctions and promote species recovery. The report pulls together current information on 90 ASAP freshwater fishes and provides broad actions to support conservation efforts. To support the delivery of these recommendations, I'm delighted that alongside the strategic framework, we are also launching the SHOAL ASAP Freshwater Fish Conservation Grant. This grant is dedicated to projects that target critically endangered freshwater fishes in Southeast Asia and can be for in situ or ex situ interventions. The deadline for pre-proposals is the 13th of August, and we hope that this webinar will inspire many of you to submit your projects. Both the framework and the grant are part of a new partnership between ASAP, SHOAL, and Mandai Nature, created in response to the staggeringly high number of ASAP fishes. Through this partnership, we aim to mobilize support and catalyze urgent conservation action for freshwater fishes in Southeast Asia. With that, I hope that you enjoy the webinar, and I'd like to hand back to Vicky.
Thank you, Narissa. Really exciting stuff, especially with the launch of the grant there. I'm now pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for today's webinar, who is Mike Baltzer, Executive Director at SHOAL. Mike is a conservation biologist with over 30 years of experience in Asia, Africa, and Europe. He began by leading biological inventory expeditions in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Uganda, and went on to lead large multi-country conservation programs. For more than 18 years, he worked for WWF as the Conservation Director for their Greater Mekong Program, Director of the Danube Carpathian Program, and was for 9 years the lead of their global tiger program, Tigers Alive. Mike left WWF in 2018 to launch a partnership that he conceived and founded focused on freshwater fish, and that's SHOAL. Mike's going to talk to us about taking action for Southeast Asia's most threatened freshwater species, freshwater fish species. Over to you, Mike.
Good morning. Can you see my presentation? And
yes,
we
can. Thank you.
And
yes,
can you hear me okay?
Clear.
Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. Oh, good morning to those people in this part of the world, and good evening to everybody else probably that's in the presentation. So as you heard, my name is Mike Baltzer, and an Executive Director of SHOAL, and just a few words about SHOAL before we start. So SHOAL, as you heard, is committed to the conservation of freshwater species, bearing in mind the fact that these species have been, particularly those species that are underneath the surface, like freshwater fishes, have been neglected for so long in terms of biodiversity conservation action. And so SHOAL has been set up to work with local partners all across the world to stop any further extinctions of freshwater fish and help recover the most threatened fishes. And this is why we're so committed to supporting this project in Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia, as many of you probably know, is a world's hotspot for biodiversity, but it's also a hotspot for threatened species. And the ASAP program is looking at critically endangered species in Southeast Asia. And the group of taxa that has the most species out of them all is freshwater fishes. And presently there's 90 species of critically endangered species that we know of in Southeast Asia, which is, like I say, is the highest group within ASAP. And so when we first set up SHOAL, one of our first priorities was to do something about these 90 species. And the first question we asked ourselves is, how do we tackle conservation of 90 species? And how do we begin to think about where to start with these 90 species? So that was the birth of this idea of doing the strategic framework. And the framework basically is a way to find avenues of work and to support and facilitate and catalyze action for these 90 species. And I really want to emphasize the word actions. So this is really all about catalyzing, accelerating action for these species. So they're critically endangered. They're all on the verge of extinction, and most of them, almost all of these fishes, have actually no conservation action for them at the moment. So the 90 species, and you're going to hear a lot more from Heok later on about the freshwater fishes of Southeast Asia. He's one of the world's experts, but they're incredibly diverse. Even within this 90 species, that they're incredibly diverse, and they're ranging from the small licorice gouramis, the Paraphomenus genus, which are these tiny, beautiful jewels that you find in the darkest swamps, peat swamps in Malaysia and Indonesia. Incredible fishes, rarely understood and rarely seen, to the giants of the Mekong catfish that you saw earlier on in Rupali's introduction. So, there's incredible diversity all across the region, and you can see on the slide that the distribution of these freshwater fishes, these critically endangered freshwater fishes across the region, with Indonesia having the most, 48, almost, or more than half of all these critically endangered fishes are in Indonesia. And that's really much more of a reflection of the diversity of Indonesian fishes, rather than the situation being worse in Indonesia than in the other country. It's just because Indonesia is so diverse and has so many freshwater fishes. And then most of the countries have at least one, but there are a few like Brunei and Timor-Leste that don't have any critically endangered species at present. And just to add that Singapore wasn't on the list when we first started this piece of work, but during that time, one species was discovered in Singapore that was never known from Singapore, but was known from Malaysia before. And so that gives you an impression of how dynamic this piece of work is as well. So this is the work that we've done will change over time, and especially as we generate much more action for these species. And the other thing to note is that pretty much all the species, there's only one species that's not just found in Southeast Asia. So they're all endemic to Southeast Asia, except for one species. Most of them are endemic to the country. So the species that are in Vietnam are only found in Vietnam, etc., etc. So, and also many of the species are really highly range restricted. And in fact, many of the species are only found in one lake, like Sheherazade is going to talk to you about the species in Lake Poso. There's like different other species were found in really restricted small places, and so they're highly vulnerable to the destruction or of those habitats, or any disturbance to those habitats. So the message to get across on this slide is that we're dealing with 90 species. Where do we start thinking about doing conservation? Which species do we do first, or how do we tackle it? It was all the questions that we were asking when we developed this strategic framework. So just a little bit, first of all, about what this document is not. And so this document is all about halting the extinction of these critically endangered fishes and beginning the recovery of these fishes and putting them into a secure place. It is not a strategy for freshwater fish conservation or freshwater conservation in Southeast Asia. That would be a much broader piece of work. This is very, very much focused specifically on the direct needs of these 90 fishes. It's also not an action plan for these 90 species. We deliberately called it a strategic framework. So it basically gives us an understanding about how do we start framing the conservation work, how to give people some guidance about where to start the work, and also people that want to support the work to think about what are the biggest priorities, and how best is it to what's the best way to tackle the conservation of these 90 species. It also doesn't include any Euro-Highland species. Those are species that that have some more marine parts of their life cycle, or live in the sea, or even brackish areas. So we're dealing with very strictly those 90 species that are found only in fresh water. And there is some mention of these 7 other species that are found sometimes in fresh water, but the majority of them, their life cycles in marine areas. So so there are things, we're not trying to do absolutely everything within this strategic framework. So the strategic framework is broken up into sections, and there is some background information about the region, the fishes, and the threats to these freshwater fishes. But I'm not going to talk too much about the background in this presentation. I'm going to hear from Heok and others about that, and I'm just going to really talk about how we've broken up things in this framework, and describe some of the ways we're hoping to tackle some of these and generate some of this action. So in the framework, there are some sort of policy areas and some broad actions that would help support the conservation of these 90 species. But again, I need to emphasize that it's not a strategic framework for doing freshwater fish conservation across the region. It's really trying to focus directly on the needs of the individual species. But there are some areas that come up often with these fishes, and it's worth noting these policy areas that do need some change, and that will have significant benefits for these 90 species. So there's things like water infrastructure, dams, river regulation, anything that changes the structure of the natural freshwater systems are having quite a significant impact on some of these species. Dams, for instance, are a big problem for many of the very large migratory fishes that we're finding in the Mekong region, Mekong Basin, and other basins with large rivers. And some of the fishes, like the giant Mekong catfish, have huge migrations along these rivers, and any dams essentially will interrupt their life cycle and cause that species to go extinct. So we really need to be thinking about broader policy action for water infrastructure. Sustainable fisheries is also important, particularly again for those Mekong fishes. Not too many of the fishes in the 90, the list of 90 are actually threatened too much by fisheries. There's just a few, as I say, some of the ones in the Mekong and the Tonle Sap area. But certainly sustainable fisheries is something that would have a significant positive support for some of these species. And another area is ornamental fish trade regulation. Many of the species, pretty much more than half of the species, are either already in the ornamental fish trade or have the potential to be in the ornamental fish trade. And at the moment, there's very little regulation on that. There's possibilities for the ornamental fish trade can have very positive support for fish conservation. Also, there are some threats related to it, but certainly we need to understand and regulate the trade in a way that doesn't allow the trade to have any bad impacts, adverse impacts on these fishes, because quite a few of them are in a trade or potentially in a trade. agriculture is quite a pervasive threat to many of the species, particularly the creation of new areas of land for agriculture, but also the pollutants that come from agriculture, and therefore getting best practices within agriculture and land development and land use planning are going to be key for many of these species too. But again, all these policy areas need to be quite well targeted for these 90 species, rather than trying to change all these across the region in general. So another important thing are the national biodiversity action plans. Each of the countries have national biodiversity action plans. We need to make sure that these fishes are mentioned in those and with clear actions, so that they receive the attention of the government in terms of biodiversity conservation. So most of the species are not found in the action plans. Many of them are not mentioned at all, and yet they're some of the highest conservation priorities for some of these countries. And in general, habitat protection, protected areas, or any type of protected areas, or making sure that these habitats are protected, is the sort of number one priority right across the region for most of these species. And that doesn't mean it has to be completely strictly protected. There's many different types of protection, but certainly being aware of where these fishes are found and creating protection for them is a very high priority to do at the sort of policy level and throughout all the countries in Southeast Asia that have these 90 species. So the next stage was to look at, we looked at the fishes, and we found that there were some common elements that are best tackled at the regional level rather than the species level or country by country. And so we call these regional priorities. These are things that could be well developed into a regional program of work. The first one are the large migratory fishes. And again, these are mainly in the large rivers, the Mekong, etc. And there's 5 species that are on this list, generally very, very large fishes that are impacted by dams, as I mentioned, impacted by fisheries and many other threats, habitat loss, and many other threats that we don't necessarily know too much about. And often the life cycle of these fishes is not very well known, but any conservation action for these fishes are going to require action by a number of different countries, not a single country. So all the Mekong countries, for instance, need to work together for all these Mekong fishes. And another common element are peat swamp forests. So there's 16 species on the list that are known to be pretty much associated with peat swamp forests. And peat swamp forests are one of the most threatened habitats in Southeast Asia. They're mainly found in Indonesia and Malaysia. And these forests are often low-lying flat areas, and the first areas to be targeted for conversion for agriculture or for other purposes. And so these swamps are drained. In fact, the swamps don't need to be completely deforested. Just by interrupting the water cycle in these forests can dry these swamps out and threaten these species. And of course, many of the people in the region will be familiar with the fires that are often associated with peat swamp forests, and these are clearly going to have a significant impact on these 16 species. And these 16 species are often very highly range restricted. So, and some of them are remaining in very, very small patches of remnant peat swamp forests. So, this requires sort of a regional approach to understanding how best to tackle these peat swamp forests and how to tackle these 16 species. So as I mentioned, the strategic framework is not an action plan. We haven't gone into the detailed planning in terms of what to do for each species, who should be involved, what sort of scale of budget is required. We do give some indications of the sort of broad scale. So is it going to require a significant amount of resources, or is it going to require a smaller amount of resources? But we really don't get into the level of a species action plan for any of the species or all of the species. So many of these species will need individual action plans for conservation, and we talk about that in the report for the individual species.
Mike, sorry, can I just interrupt and just say last couple of minutes then?
Okay, so another aspect of this work is because these fishes are so endangered, there's a large need for ex situ conservation. So this is captive breeding of the fishes to secure the populations, to provide insurance populations, but also to support any sort of reintroduction that's going to happen. So there's about 49 species that have been recommended for ex situ conservation action, and that means usually the involvement of zoos and aquaria or breeding centres or captive breeding centres, and it's very important for us as soon as possible to get these 49 species into insurance populations, well managed, and with state-of-the-art facilities to support these 49 species. Okay, so there's a section also on research and surveys, and generally the message is that we're not encouraging research as such for any of these species, because we're really focused on conservation action, and with the limited resources, it's really important to be focusing on the conservation needs of these fishes. But one of the things that's common amongst all the fishes in all these 90 fishes is that they all need more survey work. Most of them, all of them, have very little data in terms of distribution and population status or anything like that. So we are encouraging survey work for any of these species to improve the amount of information that we have. We've also listed some regional priorities where survey work for these fishes are really important, where there's particularly like the Philippines, Annamite region, Sulawesi, peat swamp forests, and Papua and West Papua. Those are areas where there's a high number of fishes out of the 90 that have significant lack of data. And then we're encouraging people to focus survey work in those areas to get a better understanding of them. But there's also some areas that we do need some research in, but more related to impact priorities. And so one of the things is the status of the aquarium trade. We don't really know much about how much is going on, the impact of that trade on many of these species. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that we need to stop the trade, but we just need to understand how much impact this has had on what type of impact, and how we can bear that in mind in terms of the management of these species. We also know very little about climate change. There's a number of species, particularly those in Papua and West Papua, that are likely to be impacted by climate change, and we really don't know anything about that. So some of these species need definitely research in terms of the future implications of climate change. And invasive species as a potential is an issue that many of the species face, particularly those species that are restricted to lakes, where fish have been introduced for one reason or other, and understanding how we can eradicate these invasive species and mitigate the impacts of these invasive species is really, really critical. But also 22 species, so that's almost a quarter of the species, are potentially extinct species. That means that they haven't been seen for quite a while, and there is a concern that they actually may be extinct. And so of course, with these species, one of the first things to do is to understand if the species is still extinct. And we divide in the report, we divided between the ones that we think that we need to go out and look for, because it may just be a case that just haven't been looked for a while, and that they're possibly there, and some species that have been searched for but haven't been seen for a long time, and that we wouldn't recommend necessarily doing really active searches for them, because it may not be particularly feasible in terms of resources. The majority of the report is divided by country. So there's a whole section with each country, with the fishes that are found there, and details about those fishes, and details about those habitats, and the conservation needs by country, because we feel that most of the action will be focused at a country level. So attention will be in Laos, or Lao PDR, or Vietnam, or Cambodia. So a significant proportion of the framework is dealt with by country, and we haven't had time today to go into details of that, but this is probably the most important section. So if you're interested in conservation of Indonesian fishes, you can turn to the Indonesia section and really just see what fishes are found in Indonesia and how best to tackle those fishes. And
hi Mike, can I just, sorry, I'm going to have to ask you to just wrap up in the next minute or so.
This is the last slide. Yeah.
Oh, super.
Yeah. So and so the framework sort of provides all these different ways of looking at these fishes and how best to tackle their conservation, but it ends also giving some indications of the things that we really need to do to make this happen. And that's again what SHOAL is all about, and Mandai ASAP is making sure that we can really get the action going. So generally, we need to build more awareness of what's going on for conservation of these fishes. We need to build awareness within policy and donors and local communities about the importance of these fishes and why we need to take action for them. We need to build partners. We're really, really keen to hear about any partners, particularly at the local level, that are interested to take action for any of these species. And that's the thing that we're doing now, is literally trying to couple local partners with each species so that we can really get support and funding and the resources that they need to make a difference for each of these species. And obviously, one of the key things is that we need to raise more funds and direct funds. And in general, the good news is that many of these species don't need massive amounts of investment and financial support. We can make quite a big difference with relatively small amounts of funding, but there's still a significant funding gap to make this strategic framework alive. So yeah, that leaves me to say thank you to everybody, and please get in touch with myself or go to our website for further details. And just to remind you that there is a call for proposals for projects for these species. Please have a look at the strategic framework if you're interested in doing that, and then and apply in the next few weeks for the funds. And we hope that these funds will grow and continue over the next few years. Many thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you. And really good to hear more about the framework there. Our next speaker is Sheherazade, or Sarah, who leads Progres, a conservation NGO to protect threatened, overlooked wildlife of Sulawesi. She has 10 years of experience in biodiversity conservation from local to international level, and is currently also doing a PhD at UC Berkeley, so keeping really busy. Yet she's always coming back to Sulawesi, where her heart belongs. Sarah's going to talk to us today about the tiny fish of Sulawesi and the big journey of galvanizing local actions to conserve them.
Hey Vicky, I guess it's my turn, yeah?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah, pardon me if there will be a little glitch because I have a bit of unstable internet. Let me share my screen.
We can hear you nice and clearly at the moment.
Okay. Oh. Yeah. Can you see my slide okay? Without my cheat?
Yes, yes, we can.
Below? Okay. Oh. All right. Okay, good mornings, everybody, and also good afternoon, especially for those who in Sulawesi in Indonesia. I'm Sarah. I'm from Progres, and today I'm so grateful and quite humble with this opportunity to share our journey to study the tiny fish in Sulawesi, specifically in Lake Poso, and would like to share to you our journey to galvanize local actions to conserve them. And I'm talking on behalf of my team. So there is Chilo, the coordinator of fish programs, and also talking on behalf of Mbak Anim, who is my partners in leading Progress, and also on behalf of Felix, the assistant coordinator of our fish programs. I'm the one who's able to speak English, so you're hearing more from me, but really this is the work of our team. And I'm very humble with this opportunity because I'm not a fish expert. I'm more in the conservation side. So for me, through this journey, I was really happy when Mike reached out to me because we finally can learn about the fascinating world of fish. They were so tiny with a very difficult scientific name. So it was quite a challenge at first, but we really enjoyed the journey despite the challenges that we are facing. So I would like to bring you to Lake Poso, or we call it Danau Poso in central Sulawesi. It's one of the largest and deepest lakes in Indonesia. The area is about 300 square kilometers, which is half of Singapore, if that helps to imagine how big the lake is. And the maximum depth is quite 450 meters. And Danau Poso is considered an ancient lakes, is along with Malili Lakes, the other lake system nearby in South Sulawesi. And these are the ancient lakes that are long-lived lakes that have existed probably more than hundreds of thousands of years. So Lake Poso is the one in the left, and these are the Malili Lake system, the one on the right, are among the smaller ancient lakes. And I also just learned that the both lake system are of tectonic origins, where Lake Poso was more likely to be formed when the eastern and the western side of the tectonic plates of Sulawesi collide, even though the timing is still uncertain. So with these long and prolonged oscillations, it allows for adaptive radiations that occur within each lake. And eventually, over time, it results in the high number of endemic species. And I would like also to mention that extensive works on this topic since 1990s have been conducted by Dr. Thomas von Rintelen and also Dr. Fabian Herder with their teams. So those who are interested in systematic biogeography and evolutionary process occurring within this ancient lake should delve into their works. And Danau Poso or Lake Poso, the uniqueness is that it has a wide sandy beach. And I just remember that when I was a kid, that was me in the orange circle. My family always go to that sandy beach, and I thought it was just by the sea. It was not a lake. So this kind of the unique features of the Lake Poso compared to Malili Lake, that white sand beach. And these are some of the endemic species frogs that have been found and described in Lake Poso, and I was so fascinated by it. So they have from the snail, the crabs, the freshwater bivalve that are not mobile, and they also have incredible diversity of shrimp species, like so tiny and so colorful. And they have I think 10 of endemic fish of Lake Poso. So each of these species, as you can see, is morphologically distinct and ecologically specialized species, which are the trademark of the adaptive radiations that occur in Lake Poso. So it's not a surprise that those of you who are nerds and systematic on evolution, Lake Poso has become the world's living laboratory, basically to study evolutions and remarkable speciations. And Lake Poso itself is one of the recognized Alliance for Zero Extinction sites. So the AZE sites means that these are the areas that hold the last remaining population of one or more species listed as endangered or critically endangered. And those of the sites are considered as key biodiversity areas because they contribute to the global conservation of biodiversity. And in Lake Poso, based on the previous research, the main threats are invasive species. So they found about 17 non-native species. As you can see here, there are ikan gabus, we call it in Indonesia, and we have ikan mas, terus ikan nila, and ikan mujair. And there were all these non-native species that already wreak havoc in the diversity and also the integrity of the Lake Poso itself. And the main challenges, as what Mike already mentions in his presentation, was the minimum survey and the research effort, which was the main hindrance if we want to start any of the conservation actions. And for Lake Poso itself, Sulawesi in general becomes one of the geographic priorities for freshwater fish conservations. And more specifically in Lake Poso, there are 3 critically endangered fish species that are assessed possibly extinct, which are Adrianictis creuti, Adrianictis rosseni, and Mugilogobius amadi. So I spent months to be able to pronounce them correctly. And these species have not been found since 1980s, and their disappearance are likely due to the predations by the invasive species. But also there is one theory that say that the fish was just disappeared because of the volcano or any earthquake in 1983, when the local community recalled that there were masses of fish found floating dead on the surface of the lake. So there was this huge uncertainty whether these 3 species are still there. So our project aims to look for these species. And just a little bit of progress. We are a conservation NGO that was based in Sulawesi. We are specialized to work on probably the most challenging wildlife of all. So we're working to protect and conserve critically endangered species that do not receive a lot of conservation attentions. And when Mike approached me to look at these programs, I look at the fish and it's critically endangered. They have not received any conservation attention, research, and protection-wise. And they also distribute outside protected areas, which these criteria are kind of fit along with all other species that Progres have been working on, from Talot cuscus, flying foxes, tortoises. So I said yes to that call without necessarily imagining the challenges that completely different context and different narrative for the fish. And in Progres, we combine the methods of science-based, which is my specializations, and also community-based conservations. So on the science part, we understand the issue, what's going on, and then we design suitable conservation programs, and in the end, evaluate the impact of our conservation programs. And then in the community side, we value compassion in the way we do our conservations, and all our teams that we need to be out there to build trust and connections with the community. We've also invested a lot of resources in building local capacity and leadership. So in our works, we always have these questions that what will happen if we are not there? So we envision that the local community is empowered to protect and conserve those endangered yet overlooked wildlife. And for our Lake Poso, we just started last year. So here, for the first year, we focus on the understanding the issues that are related to the conservation side, and also to build trust and connection with the local community, and also simultaneously build local capacity and leadership. So in this presentation, I would also like to gain more feedbacks and also future collaborations to undertake more conservation actions in the following years. So let's talk about fish. So first question, finding the fish and where to start. Perhaps what we imagined was that sending these well-equipped troops with the fishing nets going out there in the Lake Poso and trying to look for fish. But we decided that not by deploying the troops of the surveyors, but instead to start with the people, to go out there and interacting with the community, to start asking about the fish. But fish may be more specific. So what we started the conversation is about the relationship between people and the Lake Poso, how their dependence on the resources in the lake, and then eventually start asking them about these 3 possibly extinct species. So this effort was led by Chilo, and Felix was also later joined this year, and 2 of them were from Lake Poso area and have become our local champions in spearheading the effort. So as you can see here around the Lake Poso, there are 22 villages. So for the first half of the year after the project started, our team spent considerable amount of time going from village to village to meet with the community, notably with the local fishermen. And spending time with the community is our way to build relationship and trust over time, which we believe are the two components necessary to better understand in people on term about their fishing practice, how does Lake Poso mean to them, and how does the possibly extinct fish mean to them, and eventually to ensure the sustainability of any conservation programs that will be in place in the following years. So our main takeaway and progress in our approach was that as the survey is so important for this fish, but survey also provide such a valuable opportunity to introduce the project, to build trust and connections with the community. And based on, we met, I think, hundreds of people across the villages, and out of so many questions, we have one specific one that we asked was whether anyone has ever caught or seen the possibly extinct species, or where in the past they had captured or seen them. And based on this discussion with the local community, we mapped the potential areas with the possible occurrence of these 3 species that were surveyed for about 10 months of the project until April or May this year. And for sure, it's easier to say it than to be done. Even for us, we try to look for these 3 species that will help us to show to the community, have you seen this fish? But what we found was kind of the photos of the specimens of the duckbill buntingi and also the rosani. Even me, they kind of look alike. And then with Mugilogobius amadi, we don't have any pictures. So it really just to start asking questions and to be patient in imagining fish that also not really clear depicted was quite a challenge, and also can be funny at the same time. And to do that, so these fish, the Adriatic fish or the rice fish, are called locally as rono, and Mugilogobius amadi is locally called as bungu buse. And for rono, we collaborated with Dr. Daniel Lumban Tobing from Smithsonian, because I'm not a fish expert, and then none of us in Progress is a fish expert, and we believe in the collaboration. So we're so grateful with the help from Kak Daniel, who gave a training to our local team. And from that, we developed a simple guideline that can be followed by the team, and also the one that we share to the local fishermen who help us with the survey. So the survey methods, our team joined local fishermen when they try to capture rono. And this is a very rough scheme that I made, which hopefully helped me to explain. So the fishermen going to the middle of the lake with a bright lamps, and then in the middle of the lake they capture the rono. They're attracted to the light, and slowly but surely they drag the rono fish from the middle of the lake to the edge. And this process can take from 2 to 5 hours. And based on their testimony, this technique is very technical and something that can be mastered for 1 to 2 years. So based on our survey for first year, there were only 14 rono fishermen who are able to do these techniques, and our team had a nice opportunity to join them to learn how to do the fishing techniques and also at the same time looking for the fish. So these are, once they are in the edge, they put them in the net like this. These are the rono. So those 2 rono that we are looking for are quite different. So there are other rono species or rice fish in the Lake Poso. So what we've seen now is the other rice fish, the other rono, not the one that we're looking for. I wish. And this is a little bit of
Hi,
video.
Sarah. Sorry, just to say about a minute left. Thanks.
How many minutes?
About a minute left.
Okay. Yeah. These are in the middle of the lakes. So after a year, we found a lot of challenges, that there are a lot of fish in a single capture, and rono insensitive, and it takes time to differentiate among rice fish, and then TD search during early morning or late nights, and difficult to capture rono at the deeper side of the lake. So these are kind of the challenges that we're looking forward to gain more feedbacks. And then for bungu bose, the Mogilogobus amadi, we did diving, fishing for several months that were led by Chilo and Felix. And over time, these are the species that recorded in our survey, and we're still working with Kak Daniel to identify whether the Adrianictis rosseni was truly the one that we found in the lake. But we haven't found the Cruity. And also with Mogilogobus, we're still waiting for the confirmations. But my last part was that I would like to highlight that through this first year survey, we really used the opportunity to build a network of local fishermen that join our survey actively. And also if they found rono or capture, they will inform us. And at the same time, they become the messenger that explain what the program was about to other parts of the community. And we also had opportunity to understand what does the fish mean to the people. And rono and bungu buse, these tiny fish were the most beloved fish that by the community. And then bungu buse, the Mogilogobus amadi, the older generation reminisce the time when bungu buse was abandoned in the lake and expressed so much happiness to enjoy the fish. So for us, that the conservation of rono really not only about the fish, but also to conserve the traditional fishing practice and also the cultural values and the meaning of the fish that were brought to them. And I think what's next, and very keen to learn and gain feedbacks and also future collaborations to start with the larger lake landscape approach, because to address more systemic challenges like the disruptive hydrological process, the eDNA survey, and also effort to support local livelihood, address what's waste and invasive species, and eventually be able to build an integrated in situ and ex situ conservation center and explore future rewilding. And with this, I also would like to call other part of our project that Progres has been partner and support with is Celebica, that my team present here also in Lake Lindu, that they started to work on the Xenophoricillus. So I just want to show you a glimpse of hope about the freshwater fish coming from Sulawesi, Indonesia. And thank you.
So that was really lovely. Thank you. And really good to hear about the community engagement element of that work as well. I can see some questions starting to come in for the Q&A. Please continue to add them if you have more questions. We're going to get to them after our final speaker, who is Dr. Tan Heok, a Singaporean ichthyologist at the Lee Kong Chian Natural History Museum of the National University of Singapore. Heok's main interest lies in the systematics of Southeast Asian freshwater fishes, encompassing taxonomy, ecology, and biogeography. Heok's going to talk today about the discovery of new fish species in Southeast Asia based on his own expeditions. Over to you.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
My mic's unmuted. Great. So a good day to everyone, be it morning, afternoon, or evening. So being based in Singapore, we don't have that much access to natural areas, but it's a good home base to be at to go into this region, Sundaland. So just a brief introduction. I won't go through this, but basically for my basic degrees, I covered fighting fish taxonomy, faunistic survey of river basin in Sumatra, and later on for my PhD, I covered systematics of gastromyzon, basically. And thanks to ASAP, SHOAL, and Mandai for hosting this talk, and the various funds that's funded my research over the years. So initially, I have done this talk kind of before, but I've pared down quite a bit, and I've decided to focus on basically what I have done so far. So for the past 30 years, in the due course of my research, I was never really out there looking for new species, but it just so happens that when you look at a problem, you try to identify fish, you realize there are problems out there. And along the way, I've been very fortunate to have had a good mentorship and supervisorship from Prof. Peter Ng and Dr. Maurice Cotella. And in the years that's since passed, two main habitats have yielded a lot of species, peat swamps and hill streams. I have roughly described maybe about 50% of each from each habitat. So first of all, why Southeast Asia is so diverse? If you look at this, it's published actually in a paper year 2000. So many fish, so little time. So basically, Southeast Asia has a lot of new species. I mean, it has a lot of species in the rivers because of its a huge amount of coastline. We have hundreds or thousands of islands compared to, let's say, South America and Africa. And coincidentally, we're also in the Coral Triangle. So the increase in fish discoveries is not just only the use of these various concepts, but also with relevance of technology, molecular tools, digital photography, etc. So in this region, there are several very well-studied areas, started off by Rainbow in Mekong, Kapuas in West Kalimantan, and then most recently, I published my study in Central Sumatra. The amount of species diversity is fairly similar, especially with Kalimantan. Okay, and this is scanned from a color slide. This is the Batang Hari River in Jambi town in '97, and it's a map of showing basically the drainage, which literally drains just the province of Jambi. So from the results, we get roughly almost 300 species and about 50 new records for Sumatra and more than 30 new species. Not all described by myself, but with by other various scientists as well. And there are a few others which are not still being worked upon, even to this day. So just to highlight a few of these new ones, one of the smaller species, this is maxes out less than 5 cm. It's a plankton feeder, which is quite a surprise for such a small fish. Because if you dissect the gill cover away, you can see that it's got hundreds of gill rakers, and that has a specialization. So they literally feed on diatoms. And a few other new species that come and go. Some of these are actively traded in the ornamental fish trade. I think one of the audience has already asked a question, which we'll try to answer later on. So there's Betta renata, Luciocephalus aura. But one area that you should not miss out are actually the local wet markets. So like these. It can be a bit slippery to walk in, or it can be a bit cloistered, but we get rare species, sometimes a bit too large for us to collect. So an image, for instance, and a not so common fish in collections, but fairly common as a food fish in the correct place. So these are various so-called uncommon species in museum collections. And next, I look at peat swamp forests. We started going into this. Actually, my first foray into actual field collections was in North Selangor peat swamp forest in Peninsular Malaysia. And that was an eye-opening experience. First time I've gone into water that was so black and yet so acidic and yet so clear. Okay, very low pH. The pH goes down as low as 3. The water is not cloudy, it's clear. It's like strong tea. And surprises, all surprises, there are fishes that live in it and nowhere else. So unfortunately, peat swamp is a habitat that is in peril. Much of it has been destroyed. The color red is the historical coverage of peat swamps. Green is what's present, but again, this is not updated. So it's probably much less currently. So I had the fortune of flying over the northern part of Sarawak, and there's lots of nice peat swamps there. And this is probably an oxbow lake. This is in central Kalimantan, Sabangau. So there are many groups of fish that's adapted to live absolutely in acid waters. So these are few which have only found in acid water. So, and amongst which there are some rarities, like the miniature ones. So these are the true miniatures. They actually exhibit larval-like characters. So we actually named it Pedocipris. Initially discovered in central Sumatra. And then later on, we found that, oh, actually they are also found in surrounding or nearby countries. I mean, the patches of peat swamp. And these are what we call point endemics, because they're only found in that particular patch of peat swamp and nowhere else. So if that peat swamp is cleared, it's very likely the species has gone extinct. And Pedocipris carbunculus in southern Borneo. And related to the Pedocipris are the Sonodanios. There was a revision of it in 2011. And in it, I think 7 new species was described. So all the while, they've been traded in the ornamental fish trade, but the traders call them by different colors, the green one, the blue one, the red one, but they all turn out to be different. And there are also other miniatures, currently not very well studied as well. This is Quatelalemia katik. They are not so uncommon. If you find them in a good spot, you can literally get them in the tens. I won't say hundreds, but tens. So you can see this is actually one of the white desert bowls. And this is from 3-hour work in this patch of peat swamp. So you really have to dig in and you have to really get wet, sometimes in chest deep water. Okay, just to show you other examples of stenotopic or peat swamp endemics. So some of these, a lot of these fish, the small ones especially, are very popular in the ornamental fish trade. So like Desmopuntius furshi, Rhombooculatus, and some species do exhibit very marked difference in juvenile and adult coloration pattern. And if you get a good series, you realize this is part of the same series. So for instance, this species, Desmopuntius jorensis, was initially described as 2 separate species. The juvenile given a name, adult another name. But later on, this was resolved because we had a large series of specimens showing the transition. So can't help, but sometimes you think, what's happening here? Is there a convergence of pattern or is it mimicry? But we are, I mean, currently the biology of these fishes are still very understudied. And sometimes you see, am I seeing double? No. Or was it biogeographic pattern difference? So there is this case of Rasbora cortulatia, only found northwest of Borneo, and then Kalachroma, wider distribution in southern part of Borneo and Malaysia and Sumatra. Again, Rasbora Kalachroma is very popular in the ornamental fish trade. And more recently, Rasbora patrick-yapi from southern Borneo. It appears occasionally in the fish trade as well. And when I first came across this species, I only had access to preserved material, which looked really drab, and I just immediately dismissed it as, oh, that's an Anthophyne. But until I got fresh material and realized, oh, it looks really different. Okay, so it goes to show it helps to have fresh material. And this species, basically, I benefited from the ornamental fish trade. I managed to get fresh material. And a very rare species, Penjopula, first collected by German aquarists. Subsequently, we managed to find that they are seasonally abundant in streams and black water swamps. And Cortulatia hipporhynchus, its behavior is more like acanthopsids, one of the sand burrowing loaches. So we found them in heath forests with fine white sand, and these fishes actually burrow into the sand. To catch them, you basically dig into the sand and get them. So information like this will be lost if you only have the fish, but not the actual ecological data. And a couple of Silurichthys here, also found only in peat swamps. And more recently, this is of pertinence to Singapore, Enchiloclerus cheloides was discovered or described in 1994, and then subsequently never collected again from Malaysia. And it was thought to be possibly extinct until last year, when some researchers caught them in traps, not set out to catch fish, but for another project looking at semi-terrestrial crabs. And they showed me pictures of this fish, and I said, you gotta be kidding me, you know, this is not found in Singapore. It must be a scam, or you're trying to, you know, trick me. But they said, no, it's from the central catchment in Singapore. I said, really? Show me. So because their permits didn't allow the collection of fish, so we could only go in the next time when the permit's allowed to, and then we actually found it. And this is a very interesting discovery. Has basically eluded scientists all this while. That, I mean, they've always been there. And two other half-bigs found in black waters. So this is a depiction by a good colleague of mine, Kelvin. So he's trying to illustrate here why in peat swamps there's such a high diversity of labyrinth fish or air-breathing fishes. A mix of endobanthids, ostronemids, and clarids. So they have niche specialization, including China as well.
You've got
So
about 3 minutes left.
All right, and this is Sheherazade. So I will just fast forward a bit more, because that's not just only peat swamps, but I will talk a bit about the other favorite of mine, hill streams, rapids. So this is typified by a totally different kind of habitat. The base is rocky and has fast-flowing water, and the habitats are not so easy to sample in because of the fast flowing of the water. So this is basically based on my PhD work, which I, prior to the revision, there was only 11 species, and after that, an additional 25. So this involved quite a lot of legwork, examination of all museum type material, and luckily managing to get fresh topotypic material. And color was an important factor. So live fish, fresh fish, not so fresh fish. Again, the original type material and the real ones. You realize that actually there's it really benefits from having fresh material. So, and then about syntopy as well. There's usually more than one species of gastromyzon in the same stream, from 3 to potentially 5 or 6 species. Like this in Brunei, there's at least 5 species illustrated here, but another 2 or 3 more kinds of loach as well, living in the same stream. And more recently in 2021, which I have already discussed at a time when I revised the gastromyzon, that hypergastromyzon should be separate into two. So finally, I got enough material and I described one as encaria, the other remains as hypergastromyzon. Thank you.
Thanks, Heok. In the interests of time, we'll just jump straight into the Q&A. There are quite a few messages in the chat box, and I'm not sure we'll have a chance to get through all of them. So if we don't get a chance to answer your question, if you could email me, then we'll put the question to the panelists over the next few days and get back to you as soon as possible. So my email address should have just popped up in the chat. There's a question from Helene who says, in the Parasphromenos project, we are quite aware that many of the Parasphromenos species should be labeled as critically endangered in the IUCN Red List, but are not. How can we push to get this to change? In order to be able to put more focus, it seems important that the species should be labeled CR on the list, so it is a problem.
I can jump in, Michael. First of all, say hi to Helena. I know Helena, and she leads a program called the Paraphomenos Project, which is a superb project focusing on these tiny licorice gouramis, which I talked about right at the beginning. So hi to Helena. So I'm probably not the best person to tell you about the process in terms of red listing, but there's certainly there's a procedure that you need to go through to assign red listing to species, but maybe Heok can talk about that for the I'm sure he's done quite a few of these red listing.
It's a tedious process.
Yeah.
But it pays to know the most updated information. And I'm afraid to say I'm a bit outdated already by about 10 years for some of these.
Yes. So, I mean, essentially there's a process where IUCN will do the red listing. But if you, I think it's, you can do it ad hoc if you feel like you have the evidence to show that it's a critically endangered species. But do note that the other species, other categories like endangered as well, get a lot of conservation attention too. So it doesn't necessarily need to be critical. It's only because of ASAP that we're talking about critically endangered species at the moment, but certainly endangered is also a very high level of threat or category in terms of the red list. So yes, a lot more attention needs to be done for these Paraphomenos fishes.
Great, thanks, Mike. And BB asks, is there a lot of poaching of freshwater fish in Indonesia, for instance, poaching to sell overseas for hobbyists?
Do you want me to answer again? Or?
Yeah, I just add on a bit, but the word poaching is quite sensitive. Yeah,
exactly, I mean, what I was going to say.
Yeah, and also from what area are you talking about? If it's a protected area, yeah, by all means use the word poaching, but there are many areas which are not. And also you must view fish in a special way, because fish is also the cheapest form of protein and also the easiest to culture. So keep that in mind as well. And usually ornamental fish trade, if it's done properly with monitoring and some form of stock monitoring, basically, it's within control. But if the habitat is fragmented or so-called improved, that has a much worse repercussion. Yeah, that's my take.
Brilliant, thanks, Heok. This is a question for Shara from Wilhelm. It's actually two questions. Firstly, what are the challenges of conserving species in lakes compared to, for instance, rivers? And in Lake Poso, are there more shrimp species or fish species?
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for the questions. The first one, I haven't done any conservations in the river system, but what we found the main challenges in Lake Poso was that it seems it's the accumulations of, like the movie title, everything all at once in that one lakes. So we started to work on focus only on the fish, but then we realized that the problem was even larger in a way that the integrity of the Lake Poso has been declining. So we're talking about the dam, talking about the waste that were being dumped in the lake, and then the pesticide. So you know that the local fishermen reported the decline of the fish biomass, the Rono, and also they reported the decline of even the non-native species that they've been looking for, like carp, tilapia, and those other big things. But we kind of need to have some more time and even research to discern which exactly the factors that contribute to that, and then which interventions that is suitable to each of the factors, or even to address all that accumulated impact from those factors. So this kind of our main challenge. Like, I'm coming from a mama conservation, like Mike, and then we would deal with talaut kuskus, and we know exactly that it's about hunting and then about the habitat degradation. But with the fish and even in the lake, it's even way more complicated with that. And the second one, I think there are way more shrimp species than the fish species. To be exactly what number, I guess Professor Heok and also Kadaniel can tell you the number. Yeah, thank you.
Another question for you, actually, Shara. Have you encountered any resistance to conservation of the three fish species in Poso, as the communities are deeply dependent on their habitat for their livelihoods?
Yeah, I think nanti maybe Felix also can answer in the chat box. Felix, ini ada pertanyaan, apakah ada nggak sih resisten dari masyarakat tentang program konservasi atau penelitian yang orang buat ya? Felix bisa tulis di chat di sini. I think so far we haven't received any resistance yet, because our approach was to try to understand what's going on. And the fact is that the local community depend on the fish was a way for us to get a lot of supports, that we don't want to prohibit people from eating the fish because it's delicious, and also is a way for them, if they want to eat this delicious fish, they want to support us even more. So far we haven't really received resistance, but we know and we anticipate if we go for a larger landscape approach in addressing more, like mitigate impact from the dam or the waste or the invasive species, we will encounter more resistance. So it will be something that that not really look forward, but we should anticipate in the following years when we place more conservation interventions. Yeah.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. And Leon Kwok Peng asks Heok, in particular, are you concerned about the non-native fishes' proliferation in Singapore's reservoirs and waterways?
Oh, when it comes to invasive signs, there are very defined terms. So to consider a species to be invasive, it has to be a non-native species thriving and breeding in a natural habitat. So in the canals and reservoirs of Singapore, these are considered artificial habitats. And therefore, these non-native fish are not considered invasive. And anyway, these non-native fish are becoming delectable meals for our smooth-coated otter, which has been increasing in population. So its conservation can be two-edged, double-edged. So in this case, if you get rid of the non-native fish, then the smooth-coated otter will have less to eat. Well, yeah.
As ever with these things, it's more complex than it could first appear.
Yes, it is. And then also with problem with non-native fish, once it's been introduced into a system, it's very, very difficult to eradicate. There's a question here about flower horn cichlids in Lake Matano. I was going to answer that. Yes, the locals should catch more of this fish. I mean, for eating, it is after all cichlid. It will taste like tilapia. The other issue is public education. just to tell people do not release, basically.
Brilliant, thanks. That's us answering the two questions in one. Sandra has asked, is there any in situ or ex situ management for the Mekong giant catfish? And also, is there a place where they can check out a list of all the freshwater fish in Southeast Asia with conservation programs currently underway? Is there a website or a link that could be shared?
I can answer a little bit of that. So yes, there are some in situ and ex situ efforts to save the Mekong giant catfish. There's certainly breeding of giant catfish in captivity, also for commercial reasons, but certainly not enough in the sense that we still don't really know very much about the catfish, and the in situ conservation is extremely hard for the fish because the Mekong is huge. We don't know enough about the ecology of the fish, and so there's a lot more. So there's a little bit going on, but it's probably just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what it needs for conservation. But it's probably it's probably received more conservation attention than any other species out of these 90 fishes. In terms of a list, there isn't. I don't know if there is a freshwater fish list of Southeast Asia. Heok will know better than I do, but in terms of understanding about conservation programs, there isn't. I don't know if there is anything like that. I have not seen it, and I'd love to see it, and it's something that we will certainly be working on. And certainly for these 90 species that we've been talking about today, we will be doing. We'll be tracking the amount of conservation work that's going to be going on for each of these species, and we'll just regularly publish that through ASAP over time.
Just to add on a checklist of Southeast Asian fish, I would say the nearest we have is a publication in 2013 by Maurice Kotler in Raffles Bulletin of Zoology. It's actually a checklist of, it includes both Euryhaline, I mean, it's basically inland waters, so it includes some brackish elements as well. And however, it's a taxonomic checklist. So if you don't understand, or the information may not be useful in certain terms, but for a practicing taxonomist or museum worker, it's very relevant. But as again, I mentioned, it's 2013, so it's a bit outdated. Yeah.
Excellent, thank you. I think we've probably got time for one, maybe two more questions. So one from India asks, to Shara again, what predators do you see in the lake, and what kind of reasons can you think of for the extension of some of the fish species there? And they're particularly curious to know about the large fish fauna in the lake.
I think not sure predators to what. We've seen, we had a scene of a crocodile, which is maybe predators for human. And also the fish, but we've seen the invasive species, the golden cichlids that have been feeding on the native species. Yeah, this kind of from the predator perspective, but that's the only so far that we've noticed.
Oh, okay. Well, maybe we have time for one more then. Thank you, Shara. Craig Tan asks, I'm curious about the capacity of ornamental breeders and collectors, what capacity they can have to contribute to species protection. Really good question.
Heok, do you want to answer that one?
Well, based on what's available in the ornamental fish trade, just as a rough cross-section, some of the more easily bred fish are life bearers for obvious reasons. Because the babies come out basically almost juvenile versions of the adults, and they can start feeding. The problem is with the egg-laying species, or and then the fry tends to be really, really tiny. So it has to have the appropriate feed. And also knowing the biology of the fish is important. I visited fish farms, and the most common query I get is, oh, how come I can't keep this wild fighting fish, in good health? Because I would like to sell it as a healthy fish, but it always comes a bit stressed. Then the first thing I ask them is, what kind of tank or what kind of water do you keep them in? Then there lies the answer. Usually they just keep them in normal, acclimated tap water, whereas the fish is from acid water. So basic information like this is missing, so that tends to be oversight in such. And that leads to the next question. The problem with breeding of this fish, as we realize, some other very colorful fish, like from what I understand, like beta microstoma, which is the national fish, I think, for Brunei. It's been featured in the stamp series, and it's protected in Brunei. From ornamental fish breeders, aquarists, private aquarists, the fish tends to weaken over a couple of generations. So there has to be a constant input of wild fish to boost up the health of the population. So some of these wild caught fishes, without such information, we wouldn't know. And even if we've got good information on the breeding, there's no guarantee that you can fight against market sources, market demands. Because a wild caught fish at the end of the day is still cheaper than a bred fish for certain species. Unlike, let's say, a guppy, for instance. Yeah, so in order for the trade to survive and to breed enough to return, there has to be a check of balance, in a sense, a market supply kind of situation, and also an interest group. Like, again, I'm more familiar with breeding and rearing of fighting fishes. There are 70 odd species, but the most desired are like less than 10 species, because these are the more colorful ones. And what happens to the rest, the brown jobs? No one's going to keep them, and then so they become threatened. Yeah, that's what I can add.
Thanks so much to all the panelists for those insightful answers, and thanks to everybody who messaged in with some questions. Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap things up there just due to the time, and there's still quite a few open questions in the Q&A box. Just a reminder, please email them into my email address, which is in the chat, m.edmonstone@shoal.org.uk, and we'll get back to you with an answer as soon as possible. So yeah, back to Vicky. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, Michael. Well, that's the end of today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining. We are going to be sending around a survey to you all in the next day or so, and we just really appreciate you taking a minute or two to feed back to us, because your input really does help us to plan future events like this. And don't forget that if you do want to apply for the SHOAL ASAP Freshwater Fish Conservation Grant, the deadline for pre-proposals is the 13th of August, so you do not have long. All the best. Thanks everyone for joining. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
See ya.